Today, we're going to have a little lesson in historic paints, how they were formulated, how they were created, how their colors were made, and why they adhere to historic plaster. As we learned in our Master of Plaster video last week, if you can keep from painting your plaster, you should. It's such an incredible, beautiful, natural material that if you can leave it raw, leave it raw. Let it do its job, cleaning the air, helping to cool and heat your space. But if you must paint, make sure you paint the right kind of paint. Because if you don't, this is what someone will get to do in the future. I don't know if you can see that. But that's what we've been doing for 2 days. And we'll continue to do for days and days on end. Because latex-based paints do not adhere to plaster. They're going to look like they adhere. They're going to go up and they're going to look beautiful for about 10 minutes. And then as line plaster starts doing its job, which is expanding and contracting, absorbing moisture, releasing moisture, it's going to cause that latex paint to crack and to peel like a sunburn. So we get to spend the next infinitum ad infinitum peeling the old, improperly based paint off of our plaster. So let's talk about, first of all, what do you need to do if you want to paint your plaster walls with modern paints? We're so spoiled with modern paints. We go to the paint store, we pick out a color, they give us a can, they mix it up, they hand it to us, we pop it open, and we slap some paint on our walls. It's not the way it used to be done at all, and we're going to get into that. But if you want to paint over your plaster and you don't want to use an oil-based paint, which would be ideal because that oil will bond better and will not crack and peel. If you don't want to do that, then you need to use an oil-based primer. So you're going to have to use oil-based something if you want paint to stick to your plaster walls in the long term. So just be prepared for that. So let's talk about why antique paints stuck to plaster, what they were made from, and why they stuck to plaster better than our modern paints do. Everybody assumes that all historic paint is lead-based. We have been indoctrinated to believe that any paint before 1978 is lead-based. And there is a time period, 50s, 60s, 70s, where all paints were lead-based paints. Almost all paints contained lead. But that's not historically the truth, especially when you get into the 18th and 19th century. Georgian, Federal, Victorian era paints were not produced predominantly with lead. There are two different kinds of paints that were used historically. They were not produced en masse like our paints are today. So if your painter came into your home, he would bring his binding agent, which is the base, which is what the pigment would be added to, and it would cause that pigment to disperse and then bind to your surface that was being painted. He would bring separately his pigments, probably in their raw form, which normally were organic-based materials like ochre or iron oxide, and then he would get to your location and he would grind his pigments, and he would mix small batches of paint because their shelf life, once they were created, was very, very short. So small batches would be created and then applied to your surfaces. So there were two types of paint. One is an earlier type and one is a later type, or one we see earlier carrying through. So we see one in the 18th century carrying through into the 19th century, and then one we see predominantly in the 19th century usage. So the first one is called distemper paint. And it is a paint that is based out of a hide glue and water. If you don't know what hide glue is, I'm not going to give you a lesson on it here because it hurts my feelings. So you can go look that up. But it's a glue-based and water-based paint. The trick with distemper paint is it's water-based. So if you put a little distemper paint on your wall and it dried, and then you came back and you painted your next stripe of distemper paint on the wall, it's going to remove where you hit the dried paint because it's water soluble. So you're putting water on a water soluble paint. So the beauty of the application of distemper paint is it has to be done very, very quickly. There's not a lot of time for finesse. It literally has to be prepared and then basically slopped on your wall. What that creates then is a lot of variation in color, a lot of variation in pattern. It gets this very beautiful organic movement in the paint. I think Monticello, Monticello. We have a Monticello, Arkansas. Whoa. Thomas Jefferson's home is Monticello. Anyway, has a room that is still painted in its original 18th century ochre distemper paint. And I could be wrong on that, but I'm fairly certain that's where it is. And it's a beautiful color, and you can see the texture and the movement in the application of the paint, which is absolutely gorgeous. There are a few modern paint companies that are creating kind of a modern version of distemper paint. Benjamin Moore has one in a Heritage Collection, I believe, that kind of gives that same look without all the trickiness of the application that you get with true distemper paint, but where you can still get that beautiful, almost textural feel on a flat paint. So that's the kind of the earliest kind of paints that we were seeing here in the United States. Then into the 19th century, you get your oil-based paints, and it's linseed oil. Linseed oil is used as your binder, which is gummy and gooky and sticky and stinky. We know this, but man, does it make a great binder for pigment. Another reason that you see, so a lot of people who don't love earth tones get really frustrated in Victorian homes. They're like, why are all Victorian homes painted in red and dark green and dark yellow with umbers, and why do they love these dark colors? Well, that's because those were the pigments that were available, because they were naturally derived and they were highly accessible. There were a few chemically derived pigments at that point. There was Prussian blue and there was a yellow, and then later into the 19th century and early 20th century, you get more chemically derived pigments, but of course they were more expensive too. So it's a little bit less expensive at that point to use naturally derived pigments, which is funny because now if we use naturally derived pigments, it would be so much more expensive, but my, how time does change. So you get into your linseed oil as your binder, and that is an oil-based paint. That is the OG oil-based paint. Those Victorian linseed oil-based binding agents used on your surfaces. So they would adhere to your plasters and stick and be absolutely beautiful. And that's why you can go into a home built in, let's say, 1870, and if it's been left unmolested, it can still have its entire rooms full of original paints, and they're still going to have a lot of their beautiful color. They're still going to have a lot of their beautiful intensity. I posted a picture on Instagram, so if you haven't seen it, go back. We found a Dido, the bare remnants of a stairway Dido here in this project, and that red paint, after being under a skim coat of plaster and about 14 coats of paint, is still vibrant red, probably close to as vibrant as the day that it was put on the wall, and that's because it's from a naturally derived pigment source and probably a linseed oil based paint. So some of these historical products, many of these historical products are so superior to what we have today. And so if you have a historic property and you have beautiful historic walls, you want to put some paint on them, make sure you're using paints that are appropriate for the application that you're doing. Otherwise, the next person who buys your house is going to cuss you in the long term if they're scraping off the inappropriately applied product to the wall. So there's your little lesson today on historic paints. I hope you found it interesting. Hope it gave you some good information. If you have any questions or comments, drop them below, like us, subscribe to us, and help us save these historic structures. Thanks, guys.